On June 23rd in 1985, Air India Flight 182 took off from Montreal and it was blown up over the Atlantic Ocean on its way to London. All 329 people on board were killed. 280 were Canadians traveling to India. That flight disappeared from the radar off the coast of Ireland after a bomb exploded on the airplane. And 40 years later, families continue to mourn and reflect and mark its tragic legacy. The RCMP say this investigation remains one of the largest and most complex in Canadian history that exposed major gaps in intelligence sharing and how victims' families were supported. When it comes to the questions of what led up to it, well, Crown lawyers alleged during the court proceedings that the bombing was a terrorist attack against state-owned Air India as an act of revenge by BC-based Sikh extremists against the Indian government for ordering the army to raid Sikhism's holiest shrine, the Golden Temple in Amritsar, in June 1984. Two BC men, Ajay Singh Bagri and Ripudaman Singh Malik, were acquitted of murder and conspiracy charges in those two bombings. Only one person was ever convicted in the attack for his role, Inderjeet Singh Rayat, who served 30 years in jail. Now, to further understand the depth and the impact of the Air India bombing, we're now joined by Chandrima Chakraborty, a professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. She has spent much of her career creating a digital and even physical archive to preserve the memories of those who died. Chandrima, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, for those who may not know the full story, can you walk us through what happened on June 23rd, 1985? What are some of those key events that stand out to you about what happened?
So on June 23rd, 1985, a plane took off from Toronto and it was going to India. It had planned stopovers at Montreal, London, and then it was going to go to Delhi and then Mumbai. There were luggage bombs on that plane. There was a plane that came from Vancouver with two luggages full of bombs, so two suitcases. And one of those suitcases went into this plane at Montreal airport. The bomb that was in that suitcase exploded close to Cork, which is close to Ireland, on the coast of Ireland, and all 329 passengers and crew that were on that plane perished. About 100 so bodies were recovered, and it has been Canada's and continues to be Canada's largest terrorist attack. It has been called a Canadian tragedy, as we know by the public inquiry report, as key moments. In terms of criminal investigation, this is also Canada's longest and most expensive criminal investigation. So lots of salient items in terms of how this particular event how this particular event relates to Canadian history and public memory.
Chandrima, you've spent so much time speaking with the families of victims, and 40 years since this attack happened. What kind of lasting impact does this continue to have on those families?
Of course, loss and grief, right? I mean, it's not easy to lose a loved one, whether it is, a tragic accident or, doesn't matter, it's still a loss. But this loss, I think, is particularly difficult for the families because they can't make sense of it. We can't make sense of it as to how this was possible. What made it possible? Could it have been prevented? Why was it not prevented? Were there so many bunglings? Why was there so much mishandling of the evidence? Why were leads not followed up? So lots of unanswered questions. And that is something that has stayed and continues to stay with the families. So it is the grief of losing loved ones. It is also the grief of not knowing what exactly happened, and could this terrible loss have been prevented? Was that a possibility? And furthermore, I think the non-recognition. So the non-recognition of those lives lost as a loss for Canada and as a loss of Canada. There was complete non-recognition of this tragedy as a Canadian tragedy. Soon after, it was considered a foreign tragedy. And since then, this tragedy has not claimed its rightful space in Canadian history, in our public consciousness, in our public memory. And that is the lasting and continuing and persistent grief of the Air India families.
And well, just through your work, you've worked to address that. You've worked on establishing an archive. And tell us a little bit about that. What have you been working to preserve?
So we're trying to preserve the memories, the experiences, the stories of families. So this is a memory archive that is being created through donations from family members and critical witnesses like, first responders, press reporters, politicians who have, followed this tragedy from day one and have stayed with and beside the families in their moment of grief and many moments of grief rather. So these are made up of, family memorial books. So we have memorial books, we have personal letters, photographs, videos of dance performances, as families, some family members have tried to deal with loss through grief, artwork published and unpublished, letters, right? Letters from all of the prime ministers, right from Brian Mulroney to Stephen Harper, with letters sent to the families. So different kinds of archival materials, something that would allow us to create a public record of this tragedy and help to build public consciousness and awareness of this event in Canadian history.
And I understand that that was digital, but you also have some physical items. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, so we have also, I started as digital, but then some family members, without me asking, started sending me physical materials. So for example, pilots' badges. So the badges worn by the pilot and the co-pilot, the son lives in another continent and he sent it to us. So we have archival materials like that. And then, video performances, readings, right? So things like that. And as you probably know, RCMP in the last few months have been returning items that were found with the bodies. So some family members would like to donate their mom's last sari, wallet and watches and things like that. So physical donations as well. And then of course funds are limited, so it will also not be possible to digitize all of the photographs. Like I have boxes and boxes of materials in my office, which will not be possible to probably digitize. So they will still be preserved as physical donations in the library.
Chandrima, since taking this step, what kind of impact do you think this is going to continue to have? What the reaction from families? As you just mentioned, they're helping you out.
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't say they're helping me out. They are key partners to this project. They are the collaborators. They are the custodians of knowledge. They have carried and preserved these memories that are Canadian history, and they're helping me as a researcher and as a mediator here to bring their stories, their grief, this lost Canadian history, this forgotten, seldom remembered history into public memory. So the families are collaborators. The archive is a creation or made possible. This creation is made possible because of donation of families. So, they are key partners to this work.
Another point, going back to the recognition of what happened with this tragedy. CBC News has spoken to victims' families who say it's considered one of the worst attacks in Canadian history. It's not recognized as such, though. And you've connected with these families. And what more can you tell us about why this sentiment exists?
I think the initial dismissal of the tragedy as a foreign tragedy played a key role in this. So right after Air India Flight 182 crashed near the coast of Ireland, the immediate response of the Canadian government of the time was, this is a foreign tragedy. This has got nothing to do with us. These are immigrants from India bringing their animosities, their fights to our country. And we are somehow, so the Canada is somehow a victim of this foreign politics. It's got nothing to do with us. Let's not forget that bomb was made in Canada. That bomb was put in a suitcase in Canada. That bomb was put in a plane in Canada. And most of those who died on that plane were Canadians. Right? So this is not a foreign tragedy, but that initial dismissal, and in my conversations with family members, something that say, over and over again is Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who was the Prime Minister of the time, called Rajiv Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister of India at the time, to offer his condolences. And so for them, that is a non-recognition that most of the passengers on that plane were Canadians. So that first dismissal, I think, created a distancing. The plane did not crash at Pearson Airport or Mirabel Airport. It was in Ireland. It was an Air India flight. It was full of people who did not look like, quote unquote, real Canadians. They were not white. So all of these factors, I think, helped to distance the tragedy, and it has not found a place in our history or our collective memory.
And Chandrima, for those who take a pause today, or for those who don't have a clue on what this attack is, what are you hoping, looking ahead when it comes to remembrance and reflection of this tragedy? What do you hope for?
So I'm hoping that, those who are listening to this news, and there's a lot of press coverage this year, doesn't happen every year. So I'm hoping that some of that coverage will allow those who are unfamiliar with this history to perhaps take time off, if they can, to show up at the memorial services. There are memorial services that families organize annually on June 23rd, and there are very, very few people who attend those services. So if it is possible for folks to attend those memorial services this evening, whether they're in Vancouver or Montreal or Toronto, right? So if they can attend those memorial services, if they can make the effort to perhaps try to learn about this tragedy by going into the Air India Flight 182 archive, which offers lots of information and resources to become informed Canadians and informed informed global public. So I think, and I guess at the end of it is all of it is to care. So perhaps, people beyond those directly impacted by this tragedy would be moved by the grief of families, would be moved by these stories enough to care for the families, and enough to care about Canadians, and enough to care about their own history and the erasures in their own history.
Okay, Chandrima, thank you so much for your time. That again is Chandrima Chakraborty, a professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. Now, as we just heard, one of the concerns from victims' families is the lack of awareness about this terrorist attack. And we'd like to take a moment to reflect more on that. And an Angus Reid poll survey finds that few Canadians, around 1 in 5, are able to identify the Air India bombing as the deadliest terror attack Canada has endured. To help us better understand this, we're now joined by Sachi Curl, who is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. Sachi, let's just start with the poll itself. What can you tell us about that?
Well, this is beneath the second time that we've canvassed Canadians' awareness and understandings of what happened June 23rd. I think it bears notice and bears reminding that no pollster in this country had ever even asked about this issue before, right? Pollsters ask about all kinds of issues. Yeah. In 40 years, not a single other Canadian pollster had done that. We find, to your point, that about 83% of Canadians, 83%, 4 in 5, are unable to correctly identify the bombing of Flight 182 and the murder of 280 Canadian citizens as the worst terrorist attack and the worst single mass murder of Canadian citizens in our country's history. More people are more likely to identify either the shooting and the mass murder at École Polytechnique, which happened in 1989 in Montreal, or in fact, remember and think of the Canadians who died in 9/11 in New York.
So what you just said there, of course, shows a large majority don't know what this is. Are there any other key takeaways that you can tell us about?
So it's one thing to maybe not know all the details or not know the severity of the incident, and that's what we see from these results. It's another thing to have never even heard of it. And 1 in 3 Canadians, 32%, say they had never heard of the disaster, of the bombing, until we asked them about it. Right. That number rises to a majority of Canadians between the ages of 18 and 34. So our youngest adults have never heard of the bombing of Air India. I ask myself, what are we learning in schools? What's going on in terms of education? And we've just heard from Chandrama Chakraborty at McMaster University. That memorial project is a great resource, for example, for just laying out basic facts.
And did the poll reveal any other demographics beyond young people and what they remember or what they know about it?
Well, I think the really key one to hone in on is that younger demographic, because it speaks to the fact that it's not just that people are forgetting or memories fade, it's that you've got a massive number of people for whom this is a blank page over which disinformation can be rewritten or anything can be said, and we live in an age of disinformation. So, I think that is a concern. When people haven't even heard of it, they can't even sift fact from fiction around it. But I do take some comfort, if you will. I think there's some silver linings. We asked Canadians, do you think one of the things that family members have asked for repeatedly is more awareness, more education building. So I'm not sure if you knew this, but there is no exhibit at our National Canadian Museum of History outlining what happened. There is an exhibit right now on retro Canadian music between the 60s and the 80s. There is no exhibit on this. 71% of Canadians say there should be an exhibit on this. 66% say this should be taught in schools. So even if there isn't a tremendous amount of awareness, there is a desire, a level of support for raising those levels of awareness.
Did you get any insight into why there isn't this level of awareness?
Well, I think that can best be summed up in one data point that comes through quite loud and clear, and that's the fact that 50% of the people in this country actually say themselves and agree that this tragedy, this bombing, this terrorist event has never been treated like a Canadian tragedy. And among those who have higher levels of awareness of what happened tend to be older Canadians, older demographics. That number climbs to more than 60%. So again, you have, I think, an understanding of, when Professor Chakraborty or when family members say, look, this hasn't been owned as a nation. This hasn't been owned by our political leaders, our institutional leaders, our educational leaders. Canadians themselves say, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And going off of that point, when you think of tragedies that have really been discussed in Canada's history, I want to ask you about how does the awareness of this compare to others? And you kind of mentioned it before, but for example, the Polytechnic Massacre or even 9/11, how does that compare?
Well, so for example, only about 17%, as I say, of Canadians can correctly identify the Air India bombing as the case of the worst single case of mass murder in Canadian history. Only 2/3 had even heard of it. 2/3. It's pretty difficult to reconcile that against the level of coverage we've had to other disasters, and I think we all of us as a society don't want to get into the equivalency of some deaths are more important than other deaths. But for the families, and this is a small group of people now, it's a dwindling group of people beneath, a lot of the parents now who lost children and spouses, they're in their late 70s, they're in their mid 80s. They're not going to be here in 5 to 10 years. They're tired. And so the big question becomes, as Canadian society, what choices do we make as Canadians to actually say, we're going to sort of pick this up, we're going to educate ourselves, and we're going to share some of the burden of the learning and the awareness. I just had a reporter here based in British Columbia ask me questions about how I feel about this as a Canadian of Indian descent. Yes, it's true, I am of Indian descent, but what does that have to do with any of this? That kind of thinking continues to otherize and continues to marginalize and re-victimize the victims and continues to put this in a box rather than bring it out into the open and make it something that all of us have a responsibility to, at minimum, learn about.
When it comes to learning about it and preserving it, I guess, moving forward, you also heard about commemorating Air India. What did you take away from that?
I mean, commemorations have dwindled, frankly, over the years. It is often just a group of You see fewer and fewer numbers at the memorials. Often it's just family members, maybe a few police investigators or those who were there to support the family members. It does not live in the consciousness of this society. It does not live in the collective consciousness of this country. And so, what can we do to ameliorate that?
Off the beginning, you had mentioned it was 40 years since a poll was done on Air India. What kind of meaning does that hold for you to have, the Angus Reid look into this?
Well, so we did our first look at this in 2023, so that was 2 years ago,
Yes.
and then repeated again for the 40th. But prior to 2023, nothing had been done on this. I think it does just sort of again speak to a quiet or a tacit conclusion on part of institutions in this country around what is seen to be important and what isn't, and what is deemed to be important and what isn't. And the mandate of the Angus Reid Institute, where I work, where I am president, is to ask Canadians their views, awareness levels, and perceptions on all kinds of issues. I have polling data coming out in the next couple of days on defense spending. I have polling data on what it means to be Canadian and people's pride in the country, because we have Canada Day coming up.
Right.
We ask about all sorts of things, about economic issues, about public safety issues. I think the fact, again, that nobody had bothered to even gauge Canadian awareness around this for the better part of 38 years, again, really speaks to who decides what's important and who decides who is important in this country.
All right. Well, Sachi, thank you so much for your time. That, again, is Sachi Crow with us, who's from the Angus Reid Institute, the president. I appreciate it. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And 40 years after the Air India bombing, community members, they're demanding more recognition, as we've been hearing today, that remains one of the key grievances of the family of victims. Well, CBC's Saurabh Sandhu spoke with local faith groups in BC who are calling on the province to build a large memorial and a learning centre to honour the memory of the victims.
Surrey resident Vijay Chakraborty remembers visiting the Air India Memorial near Cork, Ireland, almost 2 decades ago.
I was absolutely spellbound.
Chakraborty says the memorial made him think of those who lost their loved ones in the plane crash.
That touched me at that point, seeing the warmth of the local people, the way they had kept that whole thing in their memory.
On June 23, 1985, a bomb in a suitcase aboard Air India Flight 182 exploded as the plane approached Ireland. All 329 people on board were killed, many of them Canadians. Chakraborty is part of a group that has written a letter to BC's Premier calling for a larger memorial and learning centre to be built in the province to teach younger generations about the tragedy.
My kids, they are being schooled here in Canada, in BC, and they have not heard about this. They need to know about, these things as a part of, their character building.
The campaign is being supported by many organizations, including local Hindu and Sikh faith groups.
We feel that our next generation should have an information center where they can learn about the tragedy that took place in 1985.
Yogesh Bhatia is a volunteer with Vedic Sevaks Charitable Society. He would like to see a space created that gives voice to the BC victims and their families.
At least, those people, who were killed, their family still deserve something. So that's why we are asking a memorable place and an education center so that our future generations know that violence of any type can create massive ripple effect in the society.
In a written statement, the province says it will work with community and organizations to better understand how they can continue to work to educate future generations. Major Sidhu, who lost his sister and her 2 children in the terrorist attack, says the bombing is often perceived as a tragedy affecting the Indian community, while the majority of people on board the flight were Canadians.
Air India tragedy.
He says to this day it's known as Air India tragedy, but it's part of the Canadian history. This tragedy should be taught about in schools and colleges. 40 years later, families still feel anguish. He believes building a new learning centre will create more empathy and understanding for Canadians.
Now today, commemorations and reflections mark the tragedy, and we spoke to CBC's Jessica Chung, who has been at the memorial in Vancouver.
Right now, I'm at the memorial here at Stanley Park, as you said. Now, this is the arch wall that is part of the memorial. This arch, it represents the flight path that was taken by Air India Flight 182. Now, as you can see up here at the top of the wall, there's names inscribed in there. Now, this represents all 329 people who perished during this attack, and all of their names are inscribed here. Now, not a lot of people have been attending this wall. We haven't seen a lot of people at this memorial, but we did actually speak with one woman who came to this memorial. She did not want to be on camera, but she said that we could share her story. She actually worked with Air Canada back at the time, and she said she had a part in boarding passengers onto this Air India flight. And, you know, she was very emotional. She talked about how she's been holding on to kind of these emotions for the past 4 decades. She remembers boarding a 16-year-old onto that flight. And she says on this anniversary, what she's thinking about is where that person could be now if this incident didn't happen. Now, she said this was the first time that she came to this memorial. You know, she touched these names. She remembered all of these people that, you know, she may have seen, may have boarded onto this flight, and that's something that she carries with her. So very emotional there. And of course, on top of that, there are the families of the victims who are still mourning, still grieving their loved ones after these 4 decades. Now, we spoke to Shashil Gupta, who lost his mother, Ramwadi Gupta, who's actually named right there. Now, he talks about how he feels during this anniversary and also what he misses about his mother 40 years later. Take a listen.
I've got 2 little girls, and not a day goes by that I wish my mom were alive so they could meet her, so she could meet them. The hurt doesn't go away, or hasn't for me at least. The pain hasn't gone away. It's like many other days. I remember my mom. I see her picture when I wake up in the morning, but it's a day to remember her and honor her, as well as all the other victims who perished in this tragedy.
And Jess, what's being done to commemorate the anniversary in BC today?
Yeah, so there's going to be a vigil that takes place here at the memorial tonight. That's to, of course, commemorate and remember those who lost their lives, to come together as a community, to support the family of the victims, and also to kind of remember this attack as a significant incident here in Canada. And we've been hearing it, you know, all half hour with all the experts who are talking about how there's not a lot of awareness around this incident. Not a lot of people know that it happened, and if they do, they largely see it as, you know, an incident that only impacts the Indian community, when, of course, we've talked about a majority of the people on the flight were Canadians. Now, Gupta, when we talked to him about it, says this incident tragically is a stark reminder because he says that, you know, a lot of Canadians tend to think that terrorism doesn't happen here, that it happens overseas. And this incident is a stark reminder that terrorism has touched Canada and has impacted Canadian lives and families. And so he hopes that that message kind of pulls through. And so tonight at this vigil, we're going to, you know, expect people to gather, to come together as a community and to remember those who lost their lives.
All right. Thank you, Jess.